I would go to station 1 over by Dave's.
Okay.
On, what is that, Dorian? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so we're going to finish up with fluid and electrolyte balance today, and we're going to also talk about pH. And we talked about sodium. And remember that sodium is the most abundant ion that is found outside of the cells. And so we're going to talk about potassium, and then we're going to talk about calcium as well. So if we look at potassium, potassium has a positive charge, and so it is considered to be an anion. So it is a K positive. Oops, that's a cation, sorry. Oops. Because cations are positive and anions are negative. Okay. So this is the most abundant inside the cell. So it would be intracellular.
And then are we talking about the nephrons?
No, we're talking about inside of every one of your cells.
Oh, every cell.
Every one of your cells. This is what is the most abundant cation. So it is super important, however, in the nervous system. So in the nervous system, and specifically also in the muscles, we have cells that have lots of potassium on the inside, and we have sodium on the outside. And this difference in charge between the inside and the outside of the cell is what is referred to as depolarization. So this is the difference in charge.
Oh, I forgot to tell you I have an appointment at 11, so I'm gonna leave at 10:50.
Okay. So you remember that when a cell becomes depolarized, sodium ions will flood in and will actually become negatively charged. And then to be repolarized, the potassium would have to leave. And so that the change in the sodium and potassium levels between the inside and the outside are super important. And so this just shows the inside versus the outside of the cell. So this would be inside. So this is like the axon of a nerve or a neuron. So if we look at what happens when we have too much potassium, so we would say that we are hyperkalemic, and that's with a K. This is where you have too much potassium on the outside. So sometimes this happens if your kidney is not functioning properly, because you remember that the kidney helps to reabsorb or also to secrete potassium. So if your kidney obviously helps to regulate the fluid and the electrolyte balance, and it can be that you take in too much potassium, and it might be given to you in a saline. So for example, you would have, maybe if you were a person and you were giving a saline that had too much potassium in it, then you would have too much potassium on the outside of the cell. Right? And this would decrease the ability of the nervous and the muscular system to act. So this decreases activity in the nervous and muscular tissue. Okay. So the opposite would be hypokalemic, where you have a potassium deficit. And so in this particular instance, this also causes a decrease in the nervous system. So this also influences or decreases activity. And so those levels of potassium on the inside and the outside of the cell are super important in regulating that. Okay, so that is potassium. So potassium being the most common cation that we see inside of the cells. And then when we look at calcium, it's exactly the opposite. So there is very little calcium inside the cell's fluid. Most of the calcium that we have in our body is actually stored in our bones. So when we look at calcium levels, calcium phosphate, so calcium is stored of calcium phosphate in the bones. And so we can regulate the extracellular concentrations of calcium using hormones. So if you remember from Biology 231, we talked about the PTH. And does anybody remember what PTH stands for? That is a hormone. Parathyroid hormone, okay.
I'm just going over every abbreviation I can think of from the beginning of class.
So the thyroid is that gland that is like in the center of your throat. We saw that when we did the fetal pig dissections. And so the parathyroid hormones are little patches of endocrine tissue that is in this inferior region. So it's behind the thyroid gland. And this is an important hormone because this causes the release of calcium from the bone. So the bone is actually broken down by bone-eating cells, and those we talked about were called osteoclasts. And so if you do not have enough calcium in your diet, sometimes what happens is that you then would use the calcium, you'd remove the minerals from your bones, and that actually makes your bones more brittle and more likely to break, right? So that's why they recommend that older people in particular, older women in particular, take calcium in order to make sure that there is calcium deposited in the bone and it is not removed. So if we look at the function of calcium, you'll remember that calcium is important because, and there's two charges to the calcium, so I write it like that. So calcium is important in neurons. So does anybody remember what role does calcium play in the function of transmitting an impulse from one neuron to another across the synapse?
Isn't it something to do with action potential? Like it's released into the cell?
Yes. So it has to go from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell when the action potential reaches the end of the axon. And then calcium is taken up and it causes the axon to release neurotransmitters into the synapse, right? So it causes the release of neurotransmitters into the synapse. Okay, so if calcium levels are too low, you would be hypocalcemia. So with a C instead of kalemic, and there's another C in there. So hypocalcemia would be that you have too low of calcium levels. And so this is going to inhibit the transmission of an impulse from one neuron to the next. Okay. Calcium is also stored in muscle cells. and it's actually stored in organelles. And so that's why technically it is not in the fluid. So it's not an electrolyte inside of the fluid. So it is actually stored, if you remember, we talked about the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And when the muscle cell is stimulated to contract, the calcium is released, and it binds to the actin and the myosin and causes the muscle cells to contract. So it is released into the cytoplasm and causes muscle cells to contract. Okay. So if you have too much calcium, sometimes you can get sustained muscle contraction called tetany. So tetanus, which is where the muscles will contract and they won't stop contracting. So hypercalcemia can cause sustained muscle contraction. And this can be really bad if we're talking about the heart muscle. So remember that the heart also has the sliding filaments, and that when they get depolarized, they actually let calcium into the inside of the cell from the outside. And so that can lead to heart failure. So the heart just stops beating because it stays contracted instead of relaxing. And so that can be very deadly, obviously. So we have hypercalcemia. Okay. So that's the last electrolyte that I want to talk about. But before we finish this chapter, we're going to talk about pH. So if you remember what pH is a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions. So H with a positive, that is a hydrogen ion. And it is a scale from 0 to 14. And it is the inverse. So it's actually kind of opposite, so that the lower end of the scale has a higher concentration. So when we go from 0 to 7, this is an acid, acidic, with a higher hydrogen ion concentration. So for example, a pH of 2 would have more hydrogen ions than a pH of 6. And then 7 to 14, with 7 being neutral, that is basic. That has another term, which is called alkaline, right? And that is where we have a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, so we have to maintain a relative concentration of pH in our body fluids. And so the kind of the maximum range for life is, wrote this down because I thought it was interesting, 6.8 to 7.8. So if your body fluids get above 7.8 or below 6.8, you will die, okay? So there's a range here, and usually the normal range is between 7.35 to 7.45. So that is actually a little bit basic. And this actually depends upon whether or not you're looking at blood that has high levels of oxygen, like when it's in the arteries, it will have a higher pH. And when it's returning back from the body fluids and carrying a lot of CO2, it will actually have a lower pH. So we have what are referred to as buffers. And there's several of these discussed in this chapter, but I'm only going to talk about one buffer. And this is carbonic acid. And what a buffer is it helps to maintain a relatively constant pH, no matter what is added to it or taken away from it. So we can take in acid foods, for example, and they can get reabsorbed into our blood, and the body should be able to buffer those excessive acids that we take in. And then we could also like vomit and get rid of a bunch of hydrochloric acid and then draw some of the acid out of our blood to compensate for that, to produce more hydrochloric acid for our stomach. And we should be able to buffer that difference, okay? So this is what we call a weak acid. And weak acids are interesting because like weak bases, they do not always break down into their respective ions. So they just kind of move back and forth. So if we look at H2CO3, this is carbonic acid, it goes back and forth. And so I'm going to draw my arrow going in two directions. We have a hydrogen ion and we have a bicarbonate ion. Okay, so this is carbonic acid. This is my bicarbonate ion. Okay. This is my hydrogen ion. And so what will happen is if I get an increase in hydrogen ions in the blood for some reason, the chemical reaction will go back towards this. So it'll go back towards forming carbonic acid. And then if I lose hydrogen ions for whatever reason, it will go in this direction. So if we have a plus of acid, right, it will go in that direction, right? If we lose acid, if we lose hydrogen ions, it will go in this direction, okay? So that is how it helps to buffer the changes in our body. Okay. So one thing that directly affects blood pH is, so here's another diagram. This is a strong acid. So strong acids are not useful as buffers because no matter what, they always disassociate into their ions. So hydrogen always comes apart from chloride. So this is be a strong acid. This is your weak acid, which can go in both directions. Weak bases can also serve as chemical buffers. So, okay. So let's look at the respiratory system, and this is a review. As we've talked about the respiratory system this quarter. So the thing that affects pH in the blood primarily is levels of CO2. So CO2 combines with water and it produces carbonic acid, which is where we get our carbonic acid to begin with. So this is in your blood plasma. This is also in your body fluid, so that as the CO2 crosses across the plasma membrane from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell and then gets picked up by the blood, that would also be present there. Okay. So when we look at this, we can talk about respiratory acidosis. So this would be high levels of CO2. And so what that means is that you're not breathing and you're not getting rid of the CO2 enough. So you're not getting rid of enough CO2. And so this can be a problem if, for example, you are hyperventilating, but it also can be a problem if you have lung disease and are not able to get rid of the CO2 fast enough as it's being produced, right? So this increases hydrogen ion concentration, and it decreases the pH. So it'll make the pH low. So this is, as a review, we've talked about this would be hyperventilation. Oh, sorry, hypoventilation. Hypoventilation. Sorry, so you're not breathing enough. So hypo, not hyper. So CO2 starts to accumulate in the fluids of the body. And then we have for this particular instance, what's going to happen is that we have receptors in our medulla, respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata of the brain that are going to cause an increase in breathing. So we're going to want to increase breathing rate and breathing depth. So this is kind of a short-term mechanism for fast nervous system mechanism for regulating the pH of the blood. We also have respiratory alkalosis. And this is where we have a decrease in CO2, a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration, and an increase in the pH. So this would actually be hyperventilation. So you're breathing too much. And so what will happen after hyperventilation is hopefully you'll decrease your breathing rate and decrease breathing depth. Now, if you've had damage to your brainstem, sometimes this might not work properly, right? And so you could come into a problem where you could reach your range of life-sustaining pH due to not responding appropriately to signals from your medulla oblongata. So you might have put somebody on a respirator and breathe for them. They're not breathing properly. Okay, so this is what kinds of things cause these. So hypoventilation, right? So impaired lung function. So we talked about bronchitis and emphysema. Cystic fibrosis is actually a genetic disease. Impaired ventilatory movement. Okay, so this is if you have paralyzation, and then some barbiturate or necrotic illnesses or injury to the brain stem can depress the action of the respiratory centers. And then hyperventilation can be due to strong emotions. It could also be due to if you're having problems breathing, like asthma, pneumonia, or if you're breathing at a high altitude. And then brain tumor or injury can also affect your ability to stop breathing and regulate the pH. Okay, so that's respiratory. We also have metabolic. Let's talk about metabolic. Oh, metabolism. Okay. So sometimes you hear about this a lot because they talk about having too acidic of a diet, right? Well, our body really pretty much can, if we're healthy enough, it can regulate it. But there is one thing that really affects the metabolism and pH, and that is alcohol. And the other thing is diabetes mellitus. So we can talk about metabolic acidosis. Right, so sometimes if you go on cleanses, you'll hear them talk about, oh, your blood is too acidic, right? Well, our blood probably isn't because we have mechanisms to maintain it, but you might put stress on your kidneys, for example, in regulating the pH if you don't have proper nutrition. So excessive alcohol, excessive, sorry, excessive. Okay. And the other thing is uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. So what happens with diabetes is that you lose a lot of your glucose or you stop responding to glucose. So you can't use the glucose. And so then you start to break down fats. So you use fats for energy. And this produces keto acids. So ketones, keto bodies, they sometimes call them, but these are just the breakdown of fats produces an acid. And it's kind of interesting, they also said in your book that with diabetes mellitus, that one of the signs is that when you smell their breath smells very fruity. And I'm not sure why that is the case, but it could be because of the buildup of the keto acids in the blood. But this is going to cause metabolic acidosis. Now, we do have the ability to get rid of excess hydrogen ions. So the kidneys, in this case, would act to secrete hydrogen ions into the urine. So you might predict that somebody that drinks a lot of alcohol or has uncontrolled diabetes would also have very high pH, or excuse me, low pH, very acidic urine. Okay. Then we have metabolic alkalosis. And so this would be where your pH becomes too high or the hydrogen concentration becomes too low. And this can be due to vomiting, for example. And one thing that happens with vomiting is that you lose hydrochloric acid from the stomach. And so hydrogen ions are pulled out of the blood. And so that's going to decrease the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. And our kidneys have a mechanism for this. So instead of secreting hydrogen ions, the kidneys will reabsorb those hydrogen ions. From the nephron filtrates. So they'll take it out of the filtrate that is going to eventually become the urine, and they're going to reabsorb it, and it's going to go back into the blood. Okay. Also, you can actually do this also if you ingest too many antacids. So if you take in too much basic stuff, like in over-the-counter antacids, this can also lead to metabolic alkalosis. So I guess that's something to be aware of. Okay, so here they talk about the difference between metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. And then they also talk about, in your textbook, some of the effects that this has, which generally can be life-threatening if it's not treated and if it's not compensated for by the body. Okay, so that's the last slide for fluid and electrolyte balance. So we are going to move on to reproduction. So the last two topics that we're going to talk about are reproduction, and we're going to talk about pregnancy and development. So we're going to start with the male reproductive structures and the male regulation of reproduction, looking at it from a hormonal perspective.
So is it, sorry, is this chapter 27 again?
I think it is, yes. Okay. So we have the gonads. And in males, these are the testes. And this is where sperm production takes place. Now, sperm, or actually, if you look at the testes and you dissect it, what you'll find out is the testes are full of tubules, and these tubules are called seminiferous tubules. So if I look at a cross-section of a seminiferous tubule, so this would be a cross-section through one, it has a lining of tissue, of cells, and as you go from the outside to the inside, this is how the sperm are developed. So on the outside, that is where a special type of cell division, which is called meiosis, occurs. And then the sperm will mature as they move towards the inside of the lumen. So this is my cross-section of my seminiferous tubule. This is my lumen. And this is the direction of meiosis, which is a special type of cell division that produces sperm. So we'll look at that in a second. Okay, so in mammals, the testes are actually located in scrotal sacs. And so if you think about it, that is a very precarious place to put your testes because it's not protected by the body cavity. So the ovaries are up in the body cavity and they're protected. So the scrotal sacs actually do not function in protection. It'd be much better to have the testes up. And if you look at fish or frogs or reptiles, they do not have scrotal sacs. They actually have their testes up in their body cavity. And if you even look at a lot of mammals, like if you think about rodents, sometimes they actually draw their testes up in their body cavity when they're not reproducing, and then they drop them back down when they're reproducing. So if scrotal sacs are not protected, does anybody know why mammals have their testes, not birds, interestingly, but mammals have their testes outside of the body cavity? What is the significance of that?
Temperature.
Temperature, excellent. So this lowers the temperature by about 3 degrees Celsius. So we are endothermic, so we're warm-blooded, so we tend to have a warmer, but if you think about lizards, lizards can get really hot on a road, but there's just something about we have to have a lower temperature for sperm to develop properly. And so we do have a mechanism to raise and lower the scrotal sacs depending upon temperature. So we have a mechanism for temperature regulation. And this is called the cremaster muscle. So this cremaster muscle is skeletal muscle. And it actually extends down into the testes, and it is used to raise or lower the testes. So if the testes get very cold, they get pulled up towards the body cavity where it is warmer. And if they get very hot, then they get released away from the body cavity. And so some people believe, and I think this might be true, actually I think it is true, is that if a male wants to reproduce, he needs to allow his testes some ability to move. So wearing tight underwear, for example, where the testes are always up close to the body, can actually decrease the production of viable sperm. And so those briefs, boxer shorts would allow the testes to have the ability to move. There's also another muscle called the dartus muscle. And this is in the skin. And it causes wrinkling of the scrotal sac. So the skin can also wrinkle, and that would help to, if I could have my notes here, and that would help to raise the temperature of the testes. Okay, we also have, when we look at the scrotal sac, we have what is called a spermatic cord. And so the spermatic cord contains all the vessels, so including the blood supply, so the blood vessels, it includes the nervous supply to the testes, and it includes lymphatic supply to the testes, and it also includes the vas deferens. And so this is, connects essentially the testes to the rest of the body. Okay, so we have blood vessels, we have nerves, and we have lymphatics. Okay, so if we look at a picture of this, so this is my disease. This is the outside of the scrotal sac, so they remove the scrotal sac here. So these are the seminiferous tubules inside of the testes, and this would be the spermatic cord up here. So the spermatic cord is that there's blood vessels and nerves, and there's actually a set of blood vessels in the spermatic cord that also act to regulate the temperature. It's called piniform plexus. Go back here. Oops. Plexus. And so this is a vessels that leave the testicles next to the ovaries, and it helps to cool the blood. So veins leaving the testes. Oh, I'm sorry. The heat on the arteries. So if we look at another structure that's really important, that's near to the testes and actually right attached to the testes, this is the epididymis. And what this does is this stores the sperm prior to ejaculation. That's the epididymis. And then upon ejaculation, the sperm that is stored here leaves and it travels via the vas deferens. And sometimes they call this thing else called the ductus deferens. So this is a duct that transfers ejaculation back into the body cavity. So it actually comes back into the body cavity, so fluid. So the semen doesn't it also contains nutrients and enzymes and that kind of stuff. So it has to come back and pass through the gland, and then it has to back and connect with the urethra. The urethra is the sperm body, the penis. So if we look at these structures, this is my epididymis right here. So this is the epididymis kind of surrounds the testes. And then this little tubule right here is the ductus deferens or the vas deferens. And so sometimes in most of the pictures of the male's reproductive tract, they get rid of all the other stuff in the spermatic cord and show this little ductus deferens coming up. we look at a diagram here. So here, this is practice deferens. You have to remember that this is traveling in the spermatic cord. And so as it comes up, it's going to be traveling with vessels and nervous tissue. So it doesn't travel alone. So here, it is actually going to go past these glands right here, which are paired. Those are the seminal vesicles. So this would be the next part. And these actually contribute about 60% of semen. The seminal vesicles. The fluid from the seminal vessel is yellow, and it's very thick. It is fine. So we'll say it's yellow, it's viscous, so it's very thick, and it is alkaline. It contains a nutrient, fructose. This is weird things. You know, we think about fructose, we think about plants. That's where most fructose is produced in fruit. But for some reason, fructose instead of glucose. So it uses that. That is the fuel that is going to power the sperm. So that is going to metabolize in the mitochondria, use ATP to power the flagellum to allow them to swim. The other thing about this is that it is going to produce coagulating enzymes. So what this is going to do is this is going to make the sperm, upon ejaculation into the female's reproductive system, is to make it thick. And so the coagulating enzymes prevent the semen from flowing right back out of the female's reproductive tract. And in some organisms, the coagulating enzymes actually produce a plug. And so sometimes, like in rodents and in insects, oftentimes the male's ejaculate turns solid once it's inside the female's reproductive tract, and the sperm just slowly starts to swim out, but it is a solid plug. This prevents backflow from the female's reproductive tract. Those coagulating enzymes. The other thing that was kind of interesting is the glandins. And so prostaglandins can cause smooth muscle contraction. So specifically, they cause the smooth muscle contraction in the female. So this would be in the vagina. And this helps to transport the sperm. So it helps to retain the sperm, so the vagina will contract, and it'll help to retain sperm and actually help move them further up into the vagina so that they don't flow back out. Okay, so those are the seminal vesicles, and they look like this. So they look kind of glandular when we look at them. The other gland, which is just a single gland, is called prostate gland. So prostate. And you hear a lot about the prostate gland because it gets large in older males and very difficult for urination to occur. So that's shown right here in the prostate. So this contributes about 33% of the 33% of the volume of semen. Milky and acidic. So it's whitish and it's more fluid, and it actually contains an anticoagulating enzyme. Going to, once the semen has coagulated into the vagina, it's going to start to break it down, and so it's going to liquefy so that the sperm can swim out of it. So this makes the semen with, so the sperm can swim. Okay, so if we look at these ducts, you can see that severin travels up past the small vesicles, and then it goes into the urethra. So we're going to talk about the urethra right there, and we're going to talk about the different parts of the urethra. So we'll go. So the urethra. So we're talking about urethra. We were talking about urine, right? So the urine leaves the body via the urethra.